In this episode, the ups and downs of the Almaty Hippodrome. Excitement is one of the most controversial emotions that one can feel. In antiquity, it was replaced by adrenaline received by hunters who hunted wild animals. With the development of civilization, man came up with games in which one can avoid participating but just watch the competition of others, experiencing the same gambling emotions. One of such entertainments is sports in which horses were used. Historians tend to believe that as soon as a person was able to ride a horse, the birth of equestrian sport began. Over time, people began to engage in breeding and breed new horses. Special conditions were required for this, since some horses were fast, others were hardy, and others could drag heavy loads. For those tests, special polygons were invented. The story of one of them is very interesting. Who invented this and why? Classic horse racing originated there in the 17th century. The legend that glorified Kazakhstan. He was very obedient, and he had a beautiful swan neck. Who grew mushrooms at the Hippodrome? Hippodrome workers do not like to complain. Where was the first hippodrome in Verny? Betting on horse racing in the USSR, is it true or a myth? What does the racetrack owe to Joly? Watch all this and much more in this episode. When it comes to horses, the first thing that comes to many minds is a racetrack and horse racing. From ancient times, Kazakhs loved horse racing and held them in the steppe. But when the first world-class hippodrome appeared in the country, how did it become famous and what is its fate now? Let's find out. My name is Andrei Slozhin, and this is The Time Puzzle. Many historians are inclined to believe that from the moment the horse was domesticated, equestrianism began to develop. Of course, those competitions or speed races cannot be called competitions according to clear rules and with the participation of judges. It was more like training before military campaigns. However, such trainings became the fundamental moment of the appearance and development of equestrian competitions. For example, the first official competitions using horses were held in ancient Greece at the Olympic Games. These were chariot races. However, one cannot ignore the moment that the invention of saddles and stirrups by nomads had a huge impact on the appearance of various equestrian competitions.
Байга, кызку, кокпар и многие другие народные забавы были широко распространены.
Байга, kizku, kokpar, and many other folk amusements were widespread in ancient times. However, the British are considered the founders of classic equestrian competitions. It was they who developed a clear code for horse racing. Yuri Kishchenko has devoted more than 1 year to work in the equestrian field and knows this history.
Классические скачки зародились именно там, в 17 веке.
Classic horse racing originated there in the 17th century when the lords started testing horses for agility. But why would they do that? Initially, it was just for fun, like betting. One lord had his horses, the other his own, and they galloped from one point to another. And by the way, as a consequence, by the test, they had bred the English thoroughbred race horse. Through testing, they came to their optimum measure of 1,600 meters. This is 1 mile. A horse can give the fastest speed on 1 mile. In fact, it is now quite difficult to establish exactly who owns the leadership in the creation of equestrian competitions. Indeed, for all nomadic cultures, and in particular for the Kazakhs, from time immemorial such races have been quite common. Take at least Baiga, horse race. In ancient times, everyone could take part in Baiga, on any horses. This type of competition was held at a direct distance, or in a circle. In addition, there was a complicated Baiga, Alaman Baiga. In that competition, the best qualities of the nomad horse, speed and endurance, were manifested.
В чем разница, да, между вот английскими классическими скачками, как их сейчас называют?
What is the difference between the English classic horse racing, as they are now called, and our history of nomadic peoples? Long-distance races were usual for nomads.
То есть, грубо говоря, у англичан
That is, roughly speaking, British horses are sprinters and nomads horses are stayers. Now, Baiga is now very popular and well developed in Kazakhstan. Baiga is the same horse race, only for a long distance.
Ранее использовалось, конечно, тип лошадей степной, местный.
Of course, in the past, they used steppe horses, local Mongolian horses of different breeds, which were raised there in Asia. Those horses were always unpretentious in food, in climate, and they were hardy.
Прихотливые к еде, к климату и выносливые.
Alaman Baiga was held at major holidays. People from different villages gathered in the steppe, and the best riders represented each village. The competition was not held on a specially prepared track, but simply in the steppe. Horses overcame any obstacles that they encountered on their way. The main task was to identify the most hardy horse and a skilled rider. This competition was as close as possible to the military campaigns of the nomads, because it was in battle that such a hardy horse could save the botter from death. It is important that the horse is strong and unpretentious. Perhaps this is the most important difference between the classic horse race and the horse race of the nomadic civilization.
Английская скаковая лошадь совсем другая. Ее вывели...
English racehorse is completely different. It runs for a short distance. Now they use it in the Baiga by training sprinters to become stayers, but this is today. In the past, there were other horses, and other horses were riding.
Спринтерские дистанции — это классические скачки, они от 1000 метров до...
Sprint distances are classic races. They start from 1,000 meters to 4,000 meters. And stayer, they start from 5 to 6,000 and up to 50 to 100 kilometers. Nevertheless, the basis of the long races, which according to many historians came from the nomadic world, has survived to this day. However, if the nomads often did not spare horses, since a lot depended on the speed of the horse, now riders treat horses more carefully.
Арабская лошадь во всем мире используется для таких видов, как пробег.
Arabian horse is used worldwide for endurance riding. Endurance riding is different from Baiga because in Baiga the winner is the first one. So the horse race is simple. There is only one criterion. You came first, you won. The endurance riding is very popular in the Arab countries and also in Europe. It is also done over long distances at 60, 80, 120 kilometers, but the main thing is to save a horse's energy. It isn't about being first, but about horse's shape. At certain intervals of the distance, there are veterinary units. You stop, the vet checks you, checks the horse, breathing rate, they look at how it behaves. If the horse is okay, it can go on.
Смотрят внешний вид, как она себя ведет. Если лошадь в порядке, ее отправляют дальше.
Thus, it is logical to assume that the basis for the creation of hippodromes almost throughout the world was two reasons: the test of horses and the excitement of competition. People began to build special platforms with running tracks of a certain length, where actually the test rides took place. Historians consider the ancient Greek hippodromes to be their prototype, the first mention of which is found in chronicles dated to the 2nd century AD. These huge fenced areas had the shape of a horseshoe and were equipped with benches for spectators. The organization of such competitions and participation in them had a pronounced religious meaning for people with an ancient worldview. The action was perceived as a tribute to the gods or to deceased relatives, and just before the races, the participants made a sacrifice. There are many legendary hippodromes around the world. For example, the Maiden Complex, opened in 2010 in the United Arab Emirates, is a record holder for several points at once. For example, this is the only such facility with a capacity of 60,000 people. And also the longest grass track for equestrian competitions has been created here. Its length is 2 kilometers for 100 meters. The oldest hippodrome in the world is considered to be the Roman Circo Massimo. It was one of the site of the ruins of the Circus Maximus that the ancient Romans held equestrian competitions for about 500 BC. However, for a long time the area was not built up, and most of the year the valley was cultivated and yielded crops. Kazakhstan's hippodromes have their own records. Coming up next, a story of victories and disappointments, how it all began.
Согласно архивным данным, Алматинский ипподром был основан...
According to archival data, the Almaty Hippodrome was founded in March 1930. However, as we were able to establish, the origin of such a site was long before the indicated date. This is a well-known fact for the historian Gulmira Bilyalova.
Гульмиры Беляловой.
Как известно из источников, в 1923 году на месте...
According to some sources, in 1923, on the site of the Vernensky Hippodrome, that is, this is the area where the central stadium is now located, an airfield was built there. And from that airfield, in 1936, the first flight of Almaty-Moscow, the first scheduled flight, was made.
Совершил полет, первый перелет Алмата-Москва, первый рейсовый самолет. То есть это место, где находился Верненский ипподром.
So the place where the Vernensky Hippodrome was located is indicated, but at the same time there is other information that it was on the site of a Sennaya Square in the city center. But in any case, we will build on the fact that it was on the site of the stadium, since this area was the outskirts of the city, where most likely there was a possibility of training special horses. However, even despite these data, the Almaty Hippodrome cannot be considered the first official venue for horse racing in Asia. So, for example, there is the issue of the newspaper Turkestan Vedomosti dated October 14, 1913, which speaks of the opening of autumn races at the new hippodrome in the city of Tashkent. You can learn from the article that the new beautiful building of the hippodrome was built in the form of an amphitheater so that it was convenient for the audience to watch the entire course of the race. Amounts that jockeys could win were also described. Each day will have at least 5 races. In total during the season, 5,500 rubles will be raffled. In addition, on October the 6th, bonuses for 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds born horses of the region will be awarded, and prizes, silver and bronze medals, and 200 rubles in money will be awarded.
Видимо, с разделением края при большевиках...
Apparently, with the division of the region under the Bolsheviks and with the transfer of the capital in 1927 from Kizloorda to Almaty, the need arose to build its own testing ground in the Kazakh Republic. They started building not far from the central collective farm market, which is still in Almaty. The first Soviet Almaty Hippodrome was located on Sennaya Ploshad in the square of modern streets Mametova, Tulibaev, and Nazarbayev Avenue. In 1934, it was merged with the state city stable. In the same year, the racetrack was moved from the square to another place.
Уже в 30-м году ипподром был открыт официально. В 34-м году он переехал на то место, где сейчас и находится.
Already in 1930, the Hippodrome was officially opened. In 1934, it was moved to the place where it is now. This street used to be called Lesnaya Street. It was very quiet and a cozy street. Now, this is Omarov Street. Generally, the history of this hippodrome begins from the 30s. Its main task was to prepare riding horses for competitions. They were called trials of trotters and riding horses. Our hippodrome was famous throughout the Soviet Union. At one time, there were only 3 racecourses equipped with modern tracks and sports fields: Moscow, Patygorsk, and Almaty Hippodromes. Horse breeding was actively developing in the country. In the Republic, horses were bred for the army. The government has set tasks to create the most unpretentious and hardy horses capable of serving in any climatic conditions, whether it be heat or cold. Several stud farms worked at once: Lugovskaya, Deger, and Kostanay Agricultural Experimental Station. The horses of Russian and European breeds were brought into the country and interbred with local mares. After receiving the offspring, foals were prepared for testing. The rider of the Almaty Hippodrome, Sergei Semyonov, is well acquainted with this production cycle of horses.
Конный завод разводит лошадей.
Stud farm breeds horses. It has a breeding stock and outstanding stallion producers. They choose the best. Then they get offspring from these mares, foals, and begin to practice with them. They break those 1-year-old horses. Then in the course of working with them, it is clear which one is better, which one is worse. And then at the age of 1.5 or 2 years old, they're brought to us at the hippodrome. They're passed to us, riders, and we bring them to perfection. Finishing control of one horse is not easy. But what made the task so complicated that they began to put 3 or 4 horses to one harness? As it turned out, the Civil War influenced this.
Тачанка – это конная повозка, на которую устанавливали...
The tachanka is a horse-drawn carriage on which a machine gun was mounted. It was widespread during the Civil War. Its invention is attributed to the leader of the anarchists, Nestor Makhno. However, this is not quite true. Nestor Makhno did not come up with that cart. He took the experience of the Roman warriors as a basis when they seated archers in a chariot. It was a mobile firing point. The tachanka became not only a symbol of the Civil War, but also served as a prototype for the creation of certain types of horse racing, which, by the way, were also held at the Almaty Hippodrome.
Со времен гражданской войны, когда вот
Since the Civil War, when they started to ride 4 in hand, they carried machine gun carts. 4 horses, they gave great speed. That is, to run away faster or vice versa to catch up with someone. They galloped so fast, so the managing of 4 horses, it needed some dashing skills. I did not have a chance to ride 4 in hand. I rode only trio of horses.
на тройках ездил.
The famous troika is always associated with the wide Russian field along which a dashing Cossack rushes in a wagon riding 3 horses. But few people know that the Kazakh riders who controlled the triples were not inferior to Russian athletes. At the Almaty Hippodrome, this has been proven more than once.
Обычно тройку, как запоминают, кличкой коренника. Первый был ожог такой. Вороной жеребец.
Usually a trio of horses is remembered by the nickname of leading horse. The first was Ozhog, such a black stallion of the Panfilov State Farm. He's the first record holder to set an all-union record. After him, well, you can list a long time. The most famous of the record holders are Signal of Tabak Sovkhoz, Almaty Tobacco Farm. They were our horses. Then Najdak of the Kokchetov Stud Farm, guitarist of the Kamensky Pedigree Farm.
С русскими тройками. Казахстанские, но русские тройки.
Big significant events are associated with Russian triples, that is, Kazakhstani but Russian triples. This is such a crew where 3 horses run. Well, everyone probably knows what the Russian troika is, where the leading horse runs at a trot in the middle and at the ending horses gallop. In our triples, at our hippodrome, they possessed an advantage over everyone and were winners of all union competitions. All records were set by our triples at all distances. Coming up next, Semyon Budyonny, Arab and Absent, the history of the winners.
Вторая мировая война коснулась всех союзных республик вне зависимости.
The Second World War affected all Union republics regardless of the place of hostilities. From all over the USSR, food and clothing were delivered to the front. Women and children worked in the factories. They made cartridges and shells, assembled tanks and planes. Almaty Hippodrome also did not stand aside. During the war, horses were sent from here and from stud farms to form horse regiments.
Лошадей для формирования конных полков.
Еще в годы войны
Even during the war years, horses were trained at the Hippodrome to the front. These were very good trained horses. The Cavalry Army, a division under the command of the legendary commander of the 1st Horse Army, Semyon Mikhailovich Budyonny, whose name is also associated with the Almaty Hippodrome. It was after the end of the Second World War that Semyon Budyonny gave instructions to establish stud farms in Kazakhstan where a special breed of horses would be bred, the so-called repair one, which would be resistant to temperature drops and unpretentious in keeping. The decision was made not only because the marshal made sure the Kazakh horses were unpretentious during the war, but also because of the personal sympathies of the marshal to the Almaty Hippodrome. So it is thanks to Budyonny that history knows the horse which has become a legend.
халтикинец под кличкой Араб вместе с другими халтикинцами он совершил, можно сказать, такой совершенно...
A Halteke nicknamed Arab together with other Halteke horses. He made an incomparable, unprecedented transition. It was a transition from Moscow to Ashgabat. They covered 4,300 kilometers in 84 days. Of these more than 300 kilometers, it was a crossing through the Karakum. And among these absolutely amazing, such fabulous and hardy horses was Arab. In 1935, he participated in this transition. During the war years, Arab belonged to Budyonny Semyon, that is, he also took part in the war. And there's such information that on June the 24th, 1945, it was Arab who took part in the victory parade. He was ridden by the legendary famous commander Marshal Georgy Zhukov.
Парад Победы, опять же, легендарный, знаменитый полководец, маршал Георгий Жуков.
Араб. Полковая кличка Казбек.
Arab's regimental nickname Kazbek in 1947 was presented to the Lugovsky stud farm. It was used as a manufacturer. Soon a foal was born from Arab and a mare named Bakarat, who glorified not only the Almaty Hippodrome, but the whole republic, for the whole world. They called him Absent. Absent was born in 1952 at the Jambul Stud Farm number 49. He began his trainings in 1955 at the Almaty Equestrian School. After a year of training, Absent became a participant in the Spartakiad of the Peoples of the USSR in 1956 and took 4th place there. He was returned to the Lugovsk factory, as they believed that he had failed in the task. However, despite such a result, Absent was not written off and continued training. In 1958, the horse was taken to the All-Union Agricultural Exhibition in Moscow, where he was noticed by the best dressage master at that time, Sergei Filatov.
Абсент был одним из удивительных лошадей, скакунов, которые...
Absent was one of the amazing horses, which truly deserves the fact that his monument was built at the Lugovoy stud farm. According to the description of his rider, Sergei Filatov, he had his favorite horse and he made his famous achievements with it. He participated in competitions, was a prize winner of many championships. It was a black horse of extraordinary beauty, such a glossy black horse with a proud bearing, a proud thoroughbred, head with a white star on the forehead. Filatov took Absent to replace his sick horse named Ingas. From the first days of training, the rider spoke of his new horse as a wayward animal and with quite a temper, but at the same time very obedient. In the work, Absent was obedient like a child. After my difficult studies with Ingas, training Absent seemed especially easy. True, he was very nervous, extremely scrupulous. Punishing him with spurs was an impossible thing to do. He would very violently react to such punishment and would remember it for a long time, and I never punished him severely during all my work with him, said Filatov.
Он был очень такой послушный, можно сказать, умный конь, который...
He was a very obedient, one might say smart horse, who fulfilled all the requirements of a rider and was superbly trained, and he had a beautiful swan neck. Absent became Filatov's main horse. A series of records and victories began. 5 victories at the USSR Championship in the period from 1959 to 1963. Winning the big prize at the Olympic Games in Rome in 1960. The Olympic Games in Tokyo in 1964, where 2 medals were won in the individual and team classification. In 1968, Absent again won the Olympic Games in Mexico City, where he took 2nd place in the team competition. True, it was not Filatov who ruled it then, but Ivan Kalita. Thanks to Absent, the Almaty Hippodrome began to develop intensively, of course, not without the participation of Budyonny.
За это время ипподром претерпевал несколько капитальных таких изменений, перестроек, ремонтов.
During this time, the Hippodrome underwent several major changes, rearrangements, and repairs. Until the mid-60s, the Tribune was not in this place, but on the contrary, that is from the east side. Then the podium was moved here so that the sun would not shine on the audience's eyes. In the early 60s, Marshal Budyonny, when he had already quit the armed forces, became Deputy Minister of Agriculture for horse breeding, and then, thanks to his efforts, horse breeding was raised throughout the Soviet Union, including the Almaty Hippodrome.
во всем Советском Союзе поднималось коневодство, в том числе и на Алматинском ипподроме.
Он, в принципе, как сказать, дал...
In principle, he gave the foundation to all Soviet horse breeding so that it would take place, that it would continue, that the horse factories and hippodromes would function. Of course, this is the achievement. The main directorate for horse breeding was organized. Active breeding of horses of various breeds, including the Kazakh one, began. They were tested at the Almaty Hippodrome. Galina Gorshkova, the senior steward of the Almaty Hippodrome, told it to the Time Puzzle crew.
С этого пошло как бы дальнейшее развитие ипподрома.
From here began the further development of the hippodrome. In those years, the government paid great attention to horse breeding. New horse factories and new farms appeared. And the hippodrome had to build summer stalls, and even they were not enough. At the racetrack, there could be up to 500 to 600 horses at a time. The first all-union competitions were held in Kazakhstan in 1965, and for this, they built this tribune. It is very old. They made paths, some production facilities, and new stables. It was a move forward, and participants came from all 15 republics, and there were so many people that there was no room to turn in. Immediately, the glory of the Almaty Hippodrome literally soared to heaven. It went to 5th place among the best racecourses of the entire vast Soviet Union. The competition in Almaty had a huge resonance and aroused great interest among both athletes and residents of the city. Everyone sought to get to the stands of the Hippodrome. In addition, the organizers of the races fueled the citizens' interest in the upcoming sporting events. A parade of participants was held, which began in the city center and went to the Hippodrome itself.
Еще в школьные годы мы жили недалеко от улицы Лесной на ипподроме.
Back in school years, we lived near Lesnaya Street at the Hippodrome, and there literally for several quarters there was such a roar of the crowd, people, spectators who greeted the winners of the horse races. The stands of the Hippodrome were filled to capacity, tickets were sold and were in great demand. That was the time when the racetrack was experiencing its extraordinary fame. Athletes rode the streets of the city in national costumes of the republic they represented. The press of the entire USSR trumpeted the achievements of Soviet horse breeders. At the Almaty Hippodrome during those competitions, 39 new all-union records were set.
Тогда же главным судьей был Семен Михайлович Буденный.
Then the main steward was Semyon Mikhailovich Budyonny, but he was here only at the first all-union competitions. There were a lot of horses, about 600 participants. The participants got here for several days, for example, Belarus and such distant countries.
Белоруссия и еще такие далекие страны.
Мы конкурировали во всем Советском Союзе тогда. Ну, я застал-то советское время все. Команда Казахстана...
We competed in the entire Soviet Union then. I remember those times. Kazakhstan team has always been formed at our hippodrome. It was the center of all horse breeding in Kazakhstan. Our cavalry and horse breeding teams formed here, and we went to the all-union competitions, and they were held here periodically. Horses gathered from all over the Soviet Union. The main competitions at the Hippodrome were horse racing, races of triples and fours, a competition to overcome obstacles. All this happened under the scrutiny of the stewards, who observed that there were no violations. By the way, the rules for equestrian competitions in the USSR differed from the world standards.
За границей эта история правила насчитывает более длительных срок. В них несколько многотомных.
Foreign rules are much older. They publish multi-volumes according to these rules and take into account all sorts of nuances that can occur during the races. Large international competitions are held according to those rules. Ours are much easier.
Кто придет первым?
The first criterion is who comes first, and then the drawbacks are taken into account, what violations were made, and depending on the severity of these violations, participants are qualified. No drawbacks, or some slight one, or gross violations, according to which the jockey can deprive of the prize in the race. Or they may be deprived of the right to do horse racing at all. As in any sport, serious passions flare up in races about doping or other tricks of jockeys which are rare but still happen. To avoid cheating, the stewards carefully examine the horse and rider before the race. So his weight should not exceed 60 kilograms and be no lower than 52. If the weight of the jockey is below the minimum mark, then it is weighted with special loads.
Судейская коллегия определяет вес. Определяется он от скачки, то есть с какого возраста лошади скачут, по гендерному признаку там кобылы.
The stewards determine the weight, age, and gender are taken into account. That is, a mare or a stallion. And the weight of the jockey should be within these limits. They go to scale before the race, together with ammunition, and after the race, the winners are also weighed to verify their weight. If, for example, a jockey is too light, then it turns out that he has an advantage. His horse carries less weight. He rides faster.
У него получается фора. Его лошадь меньше везет, она быстрее скачет.
If the jockey has too little weight for this race, for example, the stewards determine that the jockey should weigh 58 kilograms and he weighs 54. On ammunition, on the trench that wears under the saddle, there are special pockets where weighting materials are placed. This makes the weight even. These weighting materials can be thrown off, well, for the purity of the experiment, so that no one doubts after the race the jockeys also go to scales. Such a scrupulous approach is understandable. After all, horse racing is not only sports excitement, but big money bets.
Уверен, многие считают, что спортивный тотализатор...
I'm sure many believe that sweepstakes at that time was a hobby only for Western countries, and the Soviet leadership was clearly struggling with sports betting. In fact, it was quite the opposite.
В советское время тотализатор на нашем ипподроме был. Как бы он существовал легально, это было разрешено.
In Soviet times, there was a sweepstake on our hippodrome. It existed legally. It was allowed by the laws of the Soviet Union. So people came here, made bets. And in general, for the Soviet Union, equestrianism, horse racing, well, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that it was the most monetized even in Soviet times. Because even in Soviet times, the winners were paid cash prizes. The sweepstake worked.
Работал тотализатор, то есть на ипподромы в советское время жил в таком рыночном условии. На сегодняшний день тотализатор...
In Soviet times, the hippodrome lived in such a market condition. Today, we do not have a sweepstake at the Almaty Hippodrome. This is permitted by law today. We do not have it. For one simple reason, we need investments to make a modern sweepstake that meets today's needs. Racing bets were allowed everywhere in the USSR. Most of them were made in Almaty and Moscow. The initial amount was 50 kopek. By paying a bet at the sweepstake box office, the player received a special ticket. Tickets could be bought in an unlimited number. The legitimate excitement and easy money when winning became attractive to equestrian fans. Therefore, when the Hippodrome burned down in Moscow in 1949, the people did not want to remain without entertainment. Enterprising businessmen, in the absence of horse racing, suggested betting on trams, which route number would come next to a particular stop. The game was called Tram Prize. People put money on city transport until one of the players bribed a tram depot manager. He hit the jackpot, but the rest of the bidders found out about it, took all the prize money, and beat him. At this, tram race stopped.
Лишь в 1955 году в Москве открыли новый...
Only in 1955 a new hippodrome was opened in Moscow instead of a burned one. A huge number of thrill seekers immediately rushed there to make up for the lack of adrenaline. But what was their surprise when they saw the female riders who especially came to the competitions from Almaty. It happened in 1958 at the initiative of Semyon Budyonny. The girls of the Almaty Hippodrome arrived in Moscow for the first all-union equestrian competitions. The winner of the competition was the 8th grader from Almaty region, Rayhan Ablakhatova. Semyon Budyonny personally awarded the young rider. In addition, the metropolitan audience could enjoy the national game of Kazakhs, Kız-Ku, with their own eyes and not from the screens of movie theaters. Indeed, 3 years later, before these competitions in Moscow, the musical comedy The Jiggy Girl, directed by Pavel Bogolubov, filmed at the Almaty Film Studio of Feature and Chronicles Films, was released. Literally, in the first weeks of their rollout, it became incredibly popular. Almost 28 million people watched the film. Part of its scenes were filmed at the Almaty Hippodrome.
С Алматинским ипподромом связаны такие интересные
Such interesting historical moments are connected with the Almaty Hippodrome as the shooting of a film that has become a classic of Kazakh cinema, the Jiggy Girl, where famous horse racing takes place. In general, the Jiggy Girl is Kazku, the national Kazakh game, where the guy catches up with the girl and she must push him away with kamcha. And if he was catching up with her, then he could marry her. In general, this is the background of these competitions. Coming up next, after sunrise comes sunset, the fate of the racetrack.
90-е годы прошлого столетия. Рухнул СССР.
90s of the last century, the USSR collapsed. It was a difficult period for all the former Soviet republics.
Люди теряли работу.
Factories closed, people lost their jobs and were left without a livelihood. The Almaty Hippodrome and Kazakhstan stud farms did not escape this fate. They cancelled funding for the needs of the Hippodrome, and later it was completely removed from the responsibility of the Ministry of Agriculture. Horse racing did not take place. People stopped coming to the stands.
В постсоветское время мы несколько утеряли свои позиции в конезаводстве.
In the post-Soviet era, we somewhat lost our positions in horse breeding. It's no secret that there was a collapse. The Hippodrome was closed for some time. In general, it has a difficult post-Soviet history. Many stud farms no longer exist, and Kazakhstan horse breeding practically came to naught. People who are wealthy, who have the means, they started to go abroad, buy horses ready for competitions and bring them here. It is easier.
Когда-то этот туннель использовался для проезда техники.
This tunnel was once used to drive vehicles to the center of a racetrack to level tracks. In the 90s, it was partially flooded, and it was used by cunning cooperators in order to grow mushrooms and then sell them from the city's markets. Now there is no means to completely drain and clean it, but hippodrome workers don't like to complain. The situation got off the ground only at the beginning of the 2000s, when private stud farms began to appear in the country. Partial financing of the Almaty Hippodrome has also begun. However, much has already been lost.
На сегодняшний день у нас утеряна дорожка для рысаков. Из рысаков у нас сейчас культивируют.
Today we have lost the track for trotters. We currently only cultivate the national sport Zorga Jaris. This is a trot run by amblers. An ambler is when a horse shifts its legs parallel to the body, two legs back and forth, like this. This is a very ancient sport and very convenient for the rider. During such a ride, he does not shake and does not fall out of the saddle. Breeding of horse breeds by interbreeding the Kazakh horse and English as well as Arab breeds was completely stopped. Although the very type of horse which was used by nomads in ancient times conquered the half of Eurasia, it was possible to save it. However, it is still impossible to introduce it to the criteria of the breed.
Существует тип. Это не порода, а тип казахская верховая лошадь.
There is a type, this is not a breed, but a type of Kazakh riding horse. There's no such breed, as it is not described, and there is no stud book. Any breed has a stud book, that is, a book where all this is recorded. No stud book, no breed. That is it. It is not scientifically derived. But there is a type of Kazakh riding horse, Zhaby. Zhaby today, it is a meat horse. That is, people grow it for meat, but also in villages and owls they ride such horses, well, use it like a riding horse. Horses of the Kazakh riding type are there on the Almaty Hippodrome. This year we even arranged a race for them, and we will do it again at the closing of the season. In the period from the beginning of the 2000s to the present moment, the racetrack was repeatedly shaken by various unpleasant incidents. It was sold, there were spontaneous races, the power was lost, the water was cut off, and so on. Only recently, they have been able to resume normal operation of the stables, staff, and the testing ground. Now a race calendar has been formed. Everyone can come and feel the atmosphere of excitement, see the reconstruction of equestrian competitions of the ancient nomads, and simply enjoy the speed and strength of the horses.
Слава алматинского ипподрома осталась в прошлом.
The glory of the Almaty Hippodrome was a thing of the past. But nevertheless, now there are enthusiasts who believe that it can be revived and try to prove that the name of the Almaty Hippodrome can once again thunder throughout the world. My name is Andrei Slozhin. It was the Time Puzzle. See ya.